Greetings, friends, and welcome to this conversation regarding racism, getting the questions right to develop better solutions. Dr. Wornie Reed, Director of Race and Policy Resource Center at Virginia Tech University, will be our guest. So I welcome the United Methodists clergy and laity who will join us for this webinar session. We have some decisions and choices to make, friends. I'm quoting Dr. Eddie Claude Jr. of Princeton University, who says Americans have to decide whether this country will truly be a multiracial democracy or tinker around the edges of our problems once again and remain decidedly racist and unequal. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said human progress does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes from tireless effort of men and women, and I might add, children. Professor, author, and activist Angela Davis says we should no longer accept things we cannot change. We should change the things that we cannot accept. United Methodists should know this, that the United Methodist Constitution, our constitution for our church, speaks to racial injustice. In Article 5 of the Constitution of the United Methodist Church, these words appear. The church is a community of true believers under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Article 5, racial justice in the Book of Discipline. The United Methodist Church proclaims the value of each person as a unique child of God and commits itself to the healing and wholeness of all persons. The United Methodist Church recognizes that the sin of racism has been destructive to its unity throughout its history. Racism causes division and marginalization. The United Methodist Church shall confront and seek to eliminate racism, whether in organizations or individuals, in every facet of its life and in society at large. We commit to working with others to address concerns that threaten the cause of racial justice at all times and in all places. The last action of our most recent annual conference, held October the 10th, 2020, a virtual annual conference, a motion was presented by Reverend Lisa Schubert-Nolan that the Indiana Annual Conference develop a strategic plan or ministry action plan that demonstrates our commitment to anti-racism and to actively dismantling institutional racism in our conference by January 31st, 2021, that the plan would be in place by then. Her motion was, I move that the bishop, extended cabinet, board of ordained ministry, board of laity, develop a specific plan that includes details of resource allocation, a timeline, and point people assigned to the strategies. Our work had already begun before that motion was presented. Our work has been going on for years along with others. And for that reason, we continue that work this evening. I turn it over now to Dr. Betty Hart, who I've had the privilege of working with over the last year and a half, sometimes in person, more recently virtually, as we've joined on these many Zoom calls. Dr. Betty Hart will now lead us in our opening prayer. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good evening. Let's pray. Most precious Lord, God of all the earth, God who sees us, God who hears us, God who knows us. This is our prayer. Jesus asked the blind man calling to him from the road, "What do you want me to do for you?" The man replied, "I want to see." That is what we ask, to see Jesus in the light of the Holy Spirit, to be on the road, in the street, following him. Restore our vision, Lord, with the healing power of your mercy, that we might see Jesus, that we might live in his command, to love each other as he loves us. Give us the humility and the courage to look within and know, as we have confessed before you, that we have rebelled against your love. We have not loved our neighbors, and we have not heard the cry of the needy. Help us to stop, as Jesus did, and hear the cries of those who have been historically and systemically mistreated, ignored, and wounded. Rid our minds of all the lies, excuses, and hatred that blind our vision. A vision that reveals how far we have been misled by our own design. Replace in our hearts the healing balm of your love. Give us the courage to be the ones who step out of the crowd to follow Jesus, so that we may become one with Christ, one with each other, and one in the ministry of the world. Lord, more than ever, we pray for strength, patience, and your guidance in our call to be disciples of Jesus. In the power and grace of your holy name, amen.
Thank you, Betty. Dear friends, as you are joining and have joined on the webinar call, we would invite you to please use the Q&A option to pose any questions regarding the presentation by Dr. Reed. And at the end of Dr. Reed's presentation, Reverend Tom Heaton, who served as a staff person for Mission and Justice over these past 4 years, will present 3 or 4 questions, or however many time allows. I think it'd probably be 3 to 4 questions for response from Dr. Wornie Reed. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening to those who are joining us and those who will watch this video at a later point, Dr. Wornie Reed. Dr. Wornie Reed is currently Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies and the Director of Race and Social Policy Research Center at Virginia Tech University. Previously, he was Professor of Africana Studies and Sociology and Director of the Africana Studies program at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. Before that, he developed and directed the Urban Child Research Center in the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University, where he was from 1991 to 2001, where he also was Professor of Sociology and Urban Studies. He was an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine from 2003 to 2004. I actually met Dr. Reed through his wife, through my wife, Mildred, and First Lady Rayselda Granberry Trimble were part of a book club. He and his wife and their 2 sons, Daryl and Kyle, joined the Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church in Cleveland when I was a pastor there in the 1990s. I could read a whole lot. It would take me probably a third of his time allotted for me to read all of his resume, but let me skip down to a couple of important things. You can read this online as well. He received his BS degree in secondary education in science and mathematics at Alabama State University and an MA and PhD in sociology from Boston University. He trained as a medical sociologist under a Health and Services Research Training Fellowship. Professor Reed's honors and awards are many. They include 2 regional television Emmys he received in 2000 and 2003 for his work with Public Health Television on Urban Cancer Project, the Urban Cancer Project, which produced television shows on cancer prevention aimed at African Americans. As a youth and young man, Dr. Reed participated in the civil rights movement under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders, including the Montgomery bus boycott, the 1963 March on Washington, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Currently, he's a former member of the board of the ACLU Virginia chapter and a founding member of the Montgomery County, Virginia Dialogue on Race, an organization aimed at ending racial injustice in the county. So we've invited him because the very things that we are talking about and we seek to do are things that Dr. Reed has been doing for some time now. We like to affectionately, some of us call him Dr. Data, because if you want to enter a conversation with him, at some point he's going to bring up the data or ask you about the data. So when people were talking early on in my ministry, when the whole question around racial profiling was coming up, it was Dr. Reed, who was probably one of the foremost scholars in the country, who actually had done studies around racial profiling in the United States. So again, we welcome Dr. Wornie Reed of Virginia Tech for joining us through this webinar for Indiana and others who will be seeing this as well. Thank you, Dr. Reed.
Thank you so very much. I'm pleased to be here, especially to talk about this subject that we have agreed upon. I'm going to do a lot of talking, and I guess I should repeat that you will be able to ask me a few questions if you enter them in the question and answer box. But let me turn to the business at hand. Racism is a continuing problem in America today, and responsible citizens have obligations to figure out how to reduce the amount and extent of racism in the country. And to do this, we must ask the right questions. Or put another way, we must arrive at the proper definition of the situation. So I'll make an argument this afternoon about asking the right question and or arriving at the proper definition. And there are several assumptions that abound in society that impede our progress toward that. And I'm going to kind of include my remarks under 4 different assumptions. The first assumption is that racism has ended. Many of you may not need this, but let me contest that idea very briefly. In a labor market discrimination study that we've done at the center that I head, we've looked at all of the data in the census between 1967 and 2005, and looked at full-time workers and compared the earnings of Blacks and whites. And the bottom line is that very little has changed in this so-called post-civil rights era. We looked at these years because we wanted to see if it had, with our hypothesis that it had not changed much. So in 1967, Black full-time workers made 65 cents for every dollar that white full-time workers made. In 2005, it had grown to the mighty amount of 66 cents. That is, Blacks earned 66 cents for every dollar that whites earned. And we went further. Among the many other things we analyzed in this study was looking at the cost of this discrimination. Between 1967 and 2005, Black men in the workforce lost a total of $4.2 trillion. That's $4.2 trillion with a T, lost to the African-American community and to the country's gross national product. Let's look in another area, medical care. In 2003, as the result of being pressured by many people across the country, and I guess I was one of the many, the Congress asked the Institute of Medicine to take a look at the treatment of African Americans in medical care. And this study, which actually studied the best studies ever done in the country on this issue, found conclusively and almost without fail that African Americans did not get the same quality of care from, and this is control and fall. This is aside from the issue of whether or not they had a medical care source or whether or not they had insurance. They're looking at the same physicians treating white patients and black patients. And they're looking at the medical records, and they determine that the quality of care provided to African Americans was not equal to that provided to whites, even when the presenting symptoms were the same and they were treated by the same physicians. Okay, if we go into criminal justice, of course, many of you know, and maybe that's what precipitated this discussion, is that there's a cascade of racial disparities all across the criminal justice system. People of color, non-whites, are more likely than whites to be arrested. And admittedly, in part because of different crime rates. Yes, African Americans and Hispanics commit crimes at a slightly higher rate than whites, but there are also other reasons for these disparities, including police policies. And that's just for arrests. Once arrested, non-whites are also more likely to be charged harshly than whites. And once charged, they're more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they're more likely to receive stiff sentences. So this is actually the result after one accounts for such things as the severity of the crime or the criminal history of the participant. So we're controlling for all of these things that might enter your mind. These are just clear and obvious instances of racial discrimination. And so those are just a few of the kind of easily demonstrable issues that show racial discrimination. So let's go to another assumption. Another assumption that impede our progress in dealing with racism is the assumption that racism is something that bigoted people do intentionally. That might, of course, happen, that a bigoted person will do some racism and they will do it intentionally. But racism is a lot more than that. And racism can be intentional or unintentional. So let's look at some definitions. Prejudice and racism both refer to ways in which people devalue, demean, and disadvantage others. And by racial prejudice, we mean the attitudes that people have against persons not like themselves, that they belong to a different racial group. And that is most often dealt with in terms of people in advantaged positions feeling about people in disadvantaged positions. And of course, many people say this prejudice is the reason for the disadvantage, but I want to kind of question that a bit as we go along. Prejudice is a belief or an attitude. But when we get to racism or racial discrimination, then we're talking about something that is usually an action. So racism or racial discrimination occurs when any action or any policy has an adverse effect on a racial group because the person that may be the subject here is a member of that group. So we're talking about what legal people call disparate impact. Whether the impact of any policy is consistently one that is against a minority person, then that is racism on its face. And mind you, that's irrespective of the intentions of the perpetrator. It is the effect that matters. The intentions are irrelevant. That's not a part of the equation. So let me take a look at another couple of assumptions. One is the relationship between prejudice and racism, and the other is focusing on individual intentions and individual choices and individual actions. There's a generally held assumption that prejudice leads to racism. So to follow me along here, think about the error that many people assume exists between prejudice and racism. There's prejudice, and that is likely to lead to racism. I will agree that that is possible and that does happen. However, the next step is problematic. The assumption then, if we eliminate prejudice, we eliminate racism. So what's problematic about that is nobody is born prejudiced. So where does the prejudice come from? It has to come from somewhere. And most of the time, it's going to come from racism. So in other words, I'm arguing that the most important error is the error from racism to prejudice. A person who's prejudiced has to get it from somewhere. He might get it from the racism that exists in the family as they act toward others or act toward minorities or so on. Or it might be their social group, or it might be their school, or it might be any other number of things, or their community. But they learn it, and then they might become prejudiced. So the most important error is going from racism to prejudice. So if we want to eliminate racism, let's not spend a lot of time on prejudice. I don't mean that one shouldn't try to reduce prejudice. I'm just saying that that's not going to be very fruitful because you're working at the end result of racism, or not necessarily end result, but the result of racism. So racism produces prejudice. So if we're concerned about racism, we should address racism. Let's go to another assumption. This is the assumption that we need to focus on individuals, on individual intentions, on individual choices. And therefore we emphasize much too much in this country, individual racism. So chasing individual racism can lead us astray. Fortunately, recently in society, there's been a lot of talk about systemic racism. I'm going to try to describe and discuss systemic racism today and why it's so much more important than individual racism. So we need to focus on institutional or systemic racism rather than individual racism. Let me give you an example. I don't mean to suggest that individual racism is not extremely important. I'm just arguing it's not as important as institutional racism. For example, virtually all of you will know about the bombing of the church in Alabama in 1963 that killed 4 little girls. Now, that was an act of a couple, 2, 3 people who were doing an individual thing. It was very heinous. They killed 4 people in a church. So it can hardly get worse than that. So that's individual racism, and it's serious individual racism. It's a racism that should be contended. But I'm going to argue that there was something more important that happened there. And what was it? It was the systemic racism. Because what happened there was they were not prosecuted. So the criminal justice system did not address them at all. The elected political system did not ask the criminal justice system to do it. So they were complicit in the, we don't do that here. We don't bring whites to justice over what they do to blacks. That might have been unspoken, but it was very, very real. These people were not prosecuted until a couple of generations later. And so that was an example of systemic racism. I'm debating here whether I have enough time to give you an example of an issue that would be illustrative of the argument I'm trying to make. And I'm going to try to do that briefly. A graduate student of mine years ago did a study of two thoroughfares in a major city, because one of the thoroughfares was used predominantly by African Americans and the other thoroughfare was used predominantly by whites. So I'm going to call one the black thoroughfare and one the white thoroughfare, just to distinguish them. And the black thoroughfare had many more tickets, traffic tickets for speeding and other related things than drivers on the white thoroughfare. So we had that data and he looked at it and saw that. So then to try to determine what was going on, he bought a radar gun and measured the speed and speeding and the race by just looking at complexion of their skin, which obviously is not 100% correct, but it's better than 95% correct most of the time. And determined that, yes, one thoroughfare was used mostly by whites, the other was used mostly by blacks. But that there was more speed in on the white thoroughfare, yet the white thoroughfare had 5,000 fewer tickets per year issued. So to look into what happened, the bottom line is you discovered that there were 4 or 5 times more police cars on the black thoroughfare of the same length as the white thoroughfare. So with more police cars, there are going to be more ticketing. And this was happening under a superintendent who was an African-American who was over both of the thoroughfares. When questioned about why they deployed more cars over the black thoroughfare, it was that this is the policy that we've had for years and years, and we've always done it. And then they went on to say the reason we keep doing it is because we get more tickets. Now, you think about that for a little while. Obviously, that doesn't demonstrate that there's more speeding. It just means that you have more people to issue tickets or to stop cars or so on. So what we concluded, there's a lot more obviously to this study, but what we concluded is very clear that I have waged a long argument against this idea that it's bigoted cops, it's rogue cops, or it's bad apples in the barrel, and said, no, most of these police officers are just following the policies and practices of their offices or their superiors or so on. And that's what we discovered in this instance. So it's very clear that they hadn't changed the operation of this institution. So let's think a little bit more broadly now. That it wasn't so long ago that racial discrimination against African Americans was legal. And the way the country carried out this discrimination was through institutions, housing, law enforcement, education, and so on and on and on. And if these institutions have not changed their policies and practices, they're still practicing racial discrimination. So what we see is that this is racism, which is an attribute of institutions. And so I'm arguing that in order for us to define the situation in its best way so we can move toward solutions, we must understand that we must look at institutions and not individuals to solve society's racial issues and so on. So now, what do we do about the ticketing of these police officers? How do we solve that? Well, one of the ways should be pretty clear is that we can't solve it by having the police officers go for some kind of diversity training. We can't solve it by them even taking an implicit bias test. We can only solve it by having them change their policies and procedures. So the result of this study in this major American city, the city decided to put up cameras because they had to admit that what was happening was inappropriate. So if you send police officers in these kind of situations to some kind of sensitivity training, I'm arguing that you're just wasting time if you're trying to address racism, because that won't get it. We must deal with the policies and practices that lead to the disparities that we uncover. And if you think about it, it's very clear that institutional racism, which enters the systemic area, has much wider effect than individual racism. Okay. I want to return for a minute to criminal justice. And to some of you, it may seem that police officers have a license to kill Black Americans. Well, I stopped by this afternoon to tell you that they do have such a license. And I'm going to try to demonstrate it. They don't have a license to kill African Americans. They have a license to kill Americans, and they just happen to kill African Americans a lot more than they kill white Americans. Okay. So let me show you how this works. In 1984, there was a Supreme Court decision that about excessive force by police officers. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the ruling was that shooting, this so-called fleeing felon rule, where they were just shooting people in the back who were running away, they said that that was a violation of the person's Fourth Amendment rights. I want to move along and not go too much further in that, except to say the issue there was on the individual citizens' rights and whether they were infringed. In 1989, though, in a Supreme Court decision written by Chief Justice Rehnquist, they overturned the ideas, not necessarily the result of that earlier decision in 1984, but this was the decision called Graham v. Connor. And in that decision, Justice Rehnquist wrote that, by the way, the whole decision then turned from being whether or not the rights of an individual citizen were being infringed to that of the rights of the police officer. So things changed that fast. And so in considering the rights of the police officer rather than the citizen, Justice Rehnquist wrote a famous sentence that said you must judge whether the force used was reasonable by assuming the reasonableness of the officer on the scene at the time. In other words, you can't do post hoc analysis. Post hoc analysis would be you go to the scene and you see there is no gun, even though the police officer would say, I thought he was reaching for a gun and was about to kill me, so I killed him. And if you go there and find no gun, most of us will say that's seriously problematic. But the Supreme Court decision in 1989 says, no, if the police officer thought that his life was in danger, that's what we must judge the situation on. Okay? And it's called the reasonableness doctrine. Now, if Citizen A, sitting at a table with Citizen B, pulls out his gun and shoots and kills Citizen B, they're not going to get away with, I thought he was about to reach for an imaginary gun and kill me, and therefore I killed him. A citizen can't get away with that, but a police officer can. So I'm going to argue that if what the Chief Justice Rehnquist called the reasonableness sphere of the officer is the guiding thing, Why can't it be the reasonable fear of the citizen? Well, it's because they've turned things upside down and they've made police officers more important than citizens. Okay. For me today, talking to you, that's an important point because I want to challenge all Methodists to work to overturn that idea, unless you think a police officer is more important than a citizen. Police officers should be in the same category as soldiers, military people. Military people and police officers sign up to put their lives on the line for citizens. And they do not assume that certainly military people don't assume that their lives are more important than citizens, because every day in various places they are saving citizens and sometimes losing their life doing it. And that's why we revere them. But this decision has turned things upside down so much that police officers who kill unarmed folk have an out that no citizen has. And I want to challenge United Methodists to add that to your issues that you're looking at and help people like me argue against that doctrine, because there's something wrong with saying a police officer is more important than a citizen. But I'd better move on, and you can challenge me on that later. So there's one other thing I want to talk about before I close, and that is the companion to that Supreme Court ruling is something that protects police officers when they do misconduct, and that's the police union contracts. The police union's contracts protect police officers from prosecution even when they have obviously committed misconduct. They block accountability. Many disqualified, that is, the specifications in the contract say that they disqualify complaints about police misconduct for the flimsiest of reasons. For instance, there's a short time limit on which this must be done. Some police union contracts have that. They have it in Indianapolis and they have it in Fort Wayne. Some of us have been making studies of these contracts. Many of these contracts delay interrogation. In other words, if a citizen commits an act, a police officer can question as soon as possible. But if it's a police officer that is accused of misconduct of some kind, they usually can't be questioned for 2 or 3 days, according to most union contracts. In Indiana, such contracts exist in Fort Wayne and Terre Haute. Many of these contracts prohibit civilian oversight. In other words, you cannot have a civilian police review board according to the contract. You can have a board, but that board can't do anything about the department or officers in the department. Those prohibitions are in the contracts right now in Fort Wayne, Gary, Indianapolis, and Terre Haute. So what should be done about this? Well, we have to get these contracts abolished. So responsible citizens must contact elected officials and begin to complain about it, and then ask them to change these contracts. Obviously, sometimes they can't change them till the end, but if you start pushing the pressure early enough, then maybe that will occur. And so I think I've used all of my time, so let me just give you my parting argument. there are no neutral positions when it comes to racism. You're either fighting against it or you're complicit in it, if for no other reason than your silence. So I hope you would join many folk across the country in actively fighting against racism, addressing specific racial issues. Thank you. And I'm finished, and I think we'll entertain questions now, right?
That is correct. Hello, Dr. Reed. Got one question that has come through here so far. There may be a few more, but it's sort of a practical question. What can we do as local churches and many smaller communities here in Indiana where we have churches? What can we do as practical things or first steps in our local communities to help change institutional racism in our local communities? What are some steps? Do you have some advice on how our churches can approach local officials, local institutions, and to make that kind of change?
I would guess that many people, not necessarily the questioner, but many people in the churches would quickly think that what you do is you try to get people to deal with their individual prejudices, their individual ideas, biases, or so on, and correct that and have many sessions on it. And I argue that's a waste of time. I think that's a very good work for many ministers and others in the church to try to make good people, but he won't do anything about racism. So if you want to address racism, then I would argue that you find some issue and some group that's working on some specific issue and join them, or try to join them. And if you don't find such a group, create one, because we need many. And what I mean by specific issues is specific issues of racial discrimination. I would argue that almost nothing that you can do in the next year in Indiana would be more important than trying to get rid of those police union contracts. I just mentioned 4 or 5 cities. There are many more cities that have police union contracts there. And these union contracts are anti-democratic because it provides an outrageous level. So I would say first, educate yourself about them. Don't just take my word flat out. Go look at them and see whether you think that's the kind of country or that's the kind of community we should be living in. And if not, then you have to figure out some way to fight against it. And you need groups of people to do that. It is not going to work to have one citizen go up to the legislature and make some kind of argument. Let's do it in groups. I mean, the group might only be 5 people, but let's let it be that. That's my overall kind of response to that.
Okay, and I'll read this next question to you. This is the last one I have right now. If another one comes in while you're speaking, I'll let you know. But allowing that language such as white privilege is often received as fighting words to much of our white constituency. What would be 1 or 2 most essential door-opening messages we could communicate to our largely white congregations in a way that would foster creative dialogue rather than triggering defensiveness?
I think that's a good question. And don't blame me because I'm a professor, but I'm going to fall back on education, and I mean this from an everyday point of view. If one does not accept that there's white privilege, then you're not going to get anywhere with such a person. So the first thing is for them to understand or learn or read history or something. There must be some kind of historical thing done for them to understand that it exists, because it exists as surely as today is Sunday. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. So there's a problem with understanding the history of this country. And so I'm not saying that people need to be attacked with such words. It's just that there must be some kind of effort to get them educated into the history of this country. Because this country was built on the backs of blacks. And it wasn't just black slaves in the South. The whole country benefited from slavery. So we can start there and continue on to more recently. And so there are many books been written in the last 20 years or so to demonstrate very clearly the nature of that and the fact that white privilege is unearned privilege. It's privilege that every white person has because they were born. So my bottom line, I got lost in all that rhetoric I used, but it's that we must figure out ways, some of us who have a little more knowledge than those who have a problem with white privilege, must figure out some ways for them to understand how this country got to be where it is today. Because there's a problem with it. For example, in Virginia, the Roanoke Times, daily newspaper in Roanoke, on July 8th and July 9th, 2018, gave the best description of why people don't know that already in Virginia. They gave the best I've ever seen, okay? And so one thing that could help some people interested in this, maybe just to read Virginia and figure out, well, what happened in Indiana, because they explain it. They explain how the educational system in Virginia was what the Byrd machine wanted it to be. And the Byrd machine was one of the leaders of the no, not ever will we integrate, okay? And so therefore they changed the nature of what slavery was. They changed the nature of what the 100 years of American apartheid, that is from 1865 to 1965 was. And it was in the textbooks that people read. So I cannot go around and just jump on my fellow citizens in Virginia and blame them for knowing what they were taught to know. So we have to kind of unteach that by teaching what happened and what happened every day. By the way, African Americans have been working at this very problem, that very issue for all of my adult life, and I'm getting to be pretty old, because they're arguing that the history is not there, is not being taught. And I'm beginning to sometimes raise little issues with my fellow people who are in Black studies, that we keep doing sophisticated studies, but we need to do the simple ones and make sure that people who take our courses know a little bit more about how this country came to be. And so that's what Black Studies was started like 50 some years ago to do. And so it's not new trying to do that. We just haven't accomplished it. And I want to say one other point. As a young person, I was working with people who were working for reparations. And I had doubts that we could get reparations, but I was all for it. But the reason I was mostly for it is that I wanted to have a national debate on it, which we might still should have. And why do I want to debate? Because the first question is, why do you think you deserve reparations? Well, there are hundreds of people in the country who can tell you that, and they can start talking in the morning and not refer to any books or articles and not finish till evening to tell you exactly why, because they will lay out how this country was developed. And that is not what has been taught to most people who've gone to school in this country. I think there's another question.
There is. I'm having technical issues trying to turn my microphone on here. A comment for you, and then a question that's sort of related to that. But Carl sent a question or a statement that Faith in Indiana, which is an organization here in Indiana, Faith in Indiana is addressing police contracts, and that St. Joe County has been effective in having discussions and making changes. So it is happening here, and some people are having some luck in that. Someone wanted to know if you would happen to be aware if the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department, which borders Indiana, if the Louisville Police Department has a police union contract, and is that what protected officers involved in the shooting and death of Breonna Taylor?
Yes. Campaign Zero is my source for all of this stuff about police union contracts. And in fact, in Montgomery County right now, we're working with them as we try to do things in this state, which does not have police union contracts, but it looked like they're trying to get them, and we're trying to head it off. But that's another discussion. Let's go to Louisville. There are 6 issues that its organization Campaign Zero points out that union contracts have in them that protect police and block accountability. And it's very interesting that of these 6, and I mentioned 3 of them in my talk just now, and I can mention the others if you want to. Louisville had all 6. In other words, that blocked accountability. Minneapolis had 5 of the 6. Okay, so that's problematic. I think there's another issue that was involved in Louisville that might have been just as strong, if not stronger, than the police union contracts. And that was another issue that some of us are arguing about, and that is who prosecutes the police officers. My son, who just stepped down as being a prosecutor in Manhattan, an assistant prosecutor, argues against, even before Louisville, using state attorney generals to do that. He argues that it should be the feds, the U.S. attorneys in the area, and not even the district attorneys for the state. And I think that would have been a better outcome had we done that in Louisville. But I want to add that the Faith in Indiana needs to make other groups aware of what they are doing, because they're on something very, very important. And so they need to make other groups in Indiana aware of what they are doing.
Okay, I have just a couple more questions. What is a helpful way to evaluate our own structures and systems for racist policies?
Look at the results. If the results are, if there are results that are different from Black folks than they are for white folks, then that's a problem. If there are no differences, I would argue there are no problems. So it's not how people speak, it's not who they go to lunch with, it's what are the results of the operation of the agency of organization. And it's looking at the results. For me to call it racism, we must have a disparate impact of whatever policy or issue or thing that happens on a consistent basis that disadvantages Blacks and other minorities in comparison to whites. And that to me is a simple one. I wouldn't go in stirring up stuff when I don't have data showing disparate impact.
I have 2 last questions. I'm going to ask them to you at the same time. I think you can remember both of them or deal with them. One is, Jane wants to know the name of the article in the Roanoke Times, if you happen to remember it, that you quoted.
It's editorials on consecutive days. The editorials in the Roanoke Times are long. They are 2 columns long every day that they give one. And this is 2 columns on the 8th and 2 columns on the 9th, describing how Virginia has been miseducated.
And the last question is, and then we'll turn it back over to the bishop and let him help wrap us up here. The last question is, the attention span of most people is short at best, especially when it comes to discussing race and racism. What strategies might congregations use to have a substantive and sustainable conversation?
I'm a one-note somber, I guess. You must not try to address what any individual in the group thinks or feels, because to me that's unnecessarily disruptive. In order to have a good conversation and all, you must deal with specific issues that are outside of anyone sitting in the group. So let me give you an example of this. In the 1990s in Cleveland, when I was a parishioner of Bishop Trimble's, there was the YMCA had this thing national that they did nationally, and I was roped into it one day. I didn't want to go, but I was kind of forced, where they sit around and have the kind of discussions I've been arguing against. So a few years ago, I was telling a graduate class about racism and the problematics of discussing it by going to individual psyches and all of that. And I used the example of the Y as my bad example. And then I went home for the next class. I had to come back and apologize in class, because I said, guess what the Y has done? They're doing it exactly as I argued should be done. And they no longer do what they forced me to go through years ago. In other words, many groups are moving away from that and are having significant discussions about it. I don't know, this might go over long, but anyway, that's what I think. Now, what was the other question? I've forgotten it. Or was there another one?
The other question was the Roanoke Times,
Yeah, I did.
which you answered. So, and that's all the questions that we've received. So I'll let the bishop conclude our time with you today, Dr. Reed. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, Dr. Reed, for your presentation. I know this is a semester-long course, and we didn't give you time for covering a number of things that you could cover. For example, voter suppression. For some people think that's a figment of the imagination, and don't tie that into some of what you talked about earlier in terms of the history of the United States, whether or not voter suppression is real. United States, the bishops, many of the bishops in the United States of the United Methodist Church signed on to a document, an argument, well, not an argument, a statement that voter suppression was something real and happening even right now. And so we were just advocating for everybody to have access to vote and for every vote to count. And that was in and of itself tied also to racial discrimination, not necessarily just to African Americans. One of the things you talked about too was education. I would recommend for some to at least check it out. There's a book that I read by James Lowen, Lies That My Teacher Told Us. I'm not looking at the book now, I can't admit, maybe, yeah. lies that my teacher told me. And he reviews all the history books for over 25 years of how many things in our history books, why people find history boring, for one thing, is that that it doesn't really teach us the true story of America or any history. For example, a common notion is when people are asked, why was the Civil War fought? 20% of the people say it was because of slavery. 60% of the people say it was for states' rights. I don't know, there's another smaller percentage say it was to get Lincoln elected, and others said it was related to taxes and tariffs, when in fact the real reason was slavery. And in fact, Mississippi has a statement. They say, we are entering into the Civil War in order for us to keep our slaves. So the whole notion in terms of whether or not racism is the figment of the imagination of people who have experienced it rather than the policies that you've talked about is important for us really to continue in terms of education as well as activism. Thank you, Dr. Reed, for that work that you're doing. If you got a few minutes, if you got a couple of minutes, you want to comment at all around the current moment we're in now in terms of the rights of people to vote. Some people believe that everybody's always had the right to vote. Women, when they say women got the right to vote, all women got the right to vote, which we know is not true.
When I was an undergraduate student in Montgomery, Alabama, Black professors at Tuskegee, then Institute, now University, could not vote. Now, Montgomery was just this little oasis in the middle of the Black Belt that was not, even though that's where the Montgomery bus boycott started and all that, it was just not as bad as these other places because Blacks in Montgomery could vote, but they couldn't vote over in Selma, they couldn't vote in Lowndes County. And I'm just talking about a swath of area through the state that included Macon County, where Tuskegee is, that they were prohibited from voting to. Even professors couldn't vote. And so the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it enabled people to vote who had never been able to vote. And since then, things have happened such that Blacks have been voting. And then there's this discovery that they do vote. And therefore, the issue is they have to be blocked from voting. And I have this talk every year when we have an election. We didn't have it this year, I guess, because of the COVID. But every election year, every couple of years, I'm always asked to be on a panel for the local League of Women Voters. And last year, my topic was, my argument on that panel was that the whole history of voting in the United States has always been limiting the vote and keeping people from voting. So there's this old argument that, oh, it's a right to vote and all that. No, see, at first, only white men with property could vote. And then slowly, white men without property got the right to vote. And then slowly, Black men got the right to vote. But then they began to take that away. So they had the right to vote for about 35 years before they started all this stuff around 1900 to limit the right to vote. And right after that, women got the right to vote. But as women were getting the right to vote, they pretty much had pushed most Blacks away from the voting booths, and many Blacks could not vote. Many Blacks were voting, say, in 1870, 1875, a lot more that were voting in, say, 1910, because by 1910, they'd blocked them from voting, and you didn't get that back until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And since then, there have been all kinds of attempts to reduce the right to vote. In fact, there was a major campaign that I don't have time to go into right now in Alabama to keep people in that black belt from voting, because there were so many black folks there that they were beginning to vote themselves into office. And so that didn't work out too well for a while. But then they fought and fought and fought and got the right back. And then we find these other things happening. And the worst case out of the Supreme Court since Bush v. Gore, because I argued that that was the Supreme Court that decided that one. And I don't think the Supreme Court should decide elections. Okay. They didn't in 1876, 77. And when they still had problems, they had to work it out through compromise and so on in the Congress. It wasn't the Supreme Court. But anyway, as soon as they gutted the Voting Rights Act, and it really was a gutting, there's hardly much more right to vote now than there was in 1950, because there are no protections. As soon as they get the right to vote, the same day in Virginia where I live, they passed rigid voter regulation stuff, ID stuff. And in Texas, the same day they did something else, and they were so bad in Texas that it's gotten knocked down a couple of times. They always come back with it almost as bad, and they finally have gotten it through. But it has always been a battle to have the vote. And I just skipped over something I usually talk about, and that is America has not been serious about the vote for everybody. They wouldn't have it on Tuesday if they did. That's what I thought as a kid. Why we don't have vote on Tuesday? That's just for people who could afford to go vote on Tuesday. Most people can't go vote on Tuesday because it's not where they live. They have to take off work, and they can't get off work unless the boss gives them off work. And then sometimes they have to, take off without pay. So we've always had a problem. And that has been escalated in my mind because I have had colleagues in other countries that I work with. I've been like down to Ecuador. In Ecuador, you vote or you are fined. You have to vote. You can't not vote. If you don't vote, you're fined. Same thing with Australia. You vote or you're fined. And here, oh no, you can't let people vote. So we need to relook at ourselves on that issue. I better stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Reed, once again, on behalf of the Indiana Conference United Methodist Church. Thanks, Tom Heaton, Dr. Betty Hart, Ruth Ellen Neatler for making this webinar possible. Let's close in prayer, and we thank those who participated. This is being recorded so others will be able to see it, I think, through a link on our website. Lord God, we thank you for the gift of this time and for the education. Allow us to continue in our commitment to loving and leading and learning in ways that indeed bring us closer to beloved community. Allow us to work not just passively, but actively on being anti-racist and dismantling the institutional and systemic realities of racism. And let us start with looking at our own house and in our own institution, but also in the communities where we live, that we might indeed be a witness for Christ and a witness for good and justice. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thank you, friends. God bless you. Blessings upon you, Dr. Reed, and your family and your witness and work in Virginia and across the country as well. Thank you, friends. Good night, everybody. If I missed something, Tom, I'm sorry. I don't have the agenda in front of me, but we've already closed with prayer. So take care. Thank you.